Hugh, you believe in the traditional concept of God, and in today's world, there are a lot of alternative concepts that people are putting out. So I'd like to distinguish one from the other. First, give me a sense of what the traditional God would be in a very strong philosophical sense.
Right. The traditional God for philosophy and for traditional theology, too, was, first, he was a personal God, but also had a lot of traits that might not be the sort of thing that you would associate with the people you know, which is he knew everything. He was supposed to be capable of doing anything. He was all powerful. He was supposed to be all loving or perfectly good, which usually just turned out to be the same thing. He was supposed to be, however, a timelessly eternal God, so a God who existed completely outside of time, and is quite unlike the persons that we're familiar with. But that was the traditional theological God, not quite as anthropomorphic as the God, I think, of everyday belief that you would find in traditional Christianity, for example.
Yeah. Okay. Let's start with that as our foundation, and now ask the question: why have so many philosophers, for example, moved away from that towards images of God, descriptions of God, as they would use the term, that are non-personal? Why have they done that? Even though you don't agree with that, but tell me why they did that.
I think they've done it for more than one reason. I think it's going to vary from person to person. But one reason for doing it is that one may think that, well, a personal God really is too much to be blamed for the evil of the world. He would have to know about it. He would have to have seen it in advance or perhaps planned it. And he would have had to, in one way or another, to have willed that it occur, at least will that a world in which that evil existed occur. Mm-hmm. And they see no way of squaring that with the idea of a good personal God.
So it's the problem of evil, the conflict between an all-powerful and an all-good God on the one hand, on the other hand, the massive amount of evil in the world.
Right.
That's the primary motivation. Other motivations, or is that it?
I suppose that there would be motivations associated with the idea that a person ought to be a temporal being, and if God is not supposed to be temporal, then he might not be perfect.
And I think the idea of anthropomorphizing, reading into what the ultimate ground of being is as a person, because we're persons.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And even in the traditional conception, it was said that everything that we claim about God is true only analogically. So God is, as it were, our Father. God is, as it were, a person. God is, as it were, a loving being. And you could say that in anything you said about God, you would.
Well, you're getting a little bit soft now on the concept of person. So tell me, you think God is a person, as a personal being?
When you say that God is personal, what you mean is you're going to make out better thinking of him that way than any other way.
Okay, so fine, I accept that, but now give me some characteristics. Don't be general on me. What are some characteristics of a personal God that you would think is more likely than an impersonal God?
Well, a personal God has a will. He has a disposition toward us, right? And he can be thought of as dealing with us. So even as interacting with us, although it would have to be an unusual form of interaction for a God that was not a temporal God. And he could be seen as seeing to our well-being, as caring about us, and as taking action to alleviate our difficulties and our pain and our problems.
So I hear two concepts, there may be more. One is a will, and I think if you have a will, you have to have a conscious, an awareness,
right,
and an intention.
You have to have both. In fact, you can't will something without knowing what it is that you're willing.
Right, so you have to know,
so
be
you
aware.
have to be aware, right? And then intention is just built into the idea of willing. It's impossible to, for example, to accidentally decide to do something. If a student comes to me and says, "I'm sorry I missed your class, Professor McCann, the other day because I accidentally decided not to come," right. He's not going to get very far.
Right, sure. Okay. All right. So we have awareness and we have intention, and that's the will, and that's. And that, do you need anything more to be a person other than those two things? Anything?
I think
anything
probably not.
Okay.
Probably not.
So we want to be minimalist. We want to say what is the minimum criteria to be a person? So we got two. Now we have a large number of philosophers, at least, wanting to negate that as something that's real. And whether they go into pantheism or value being ultimate or somehow being a Christian with an impersonal God, I can't figure that quite out. We have a lot now, and their motivation is these multiple motivations centered on the problem of evil. So, what is your critique of that? I mean, it seems like pretty strong arguments.
Well, when you look at the problem of evil, anyone who is a philosophical theologian or theologian has to deal with that problem. Anyone's a human being has to address that problem of how it is that there could be so much evil in the world if, in fact, there is this loving personal God out there to take care of it. Now, if you think that it's all God's doing, that is, that God's responsible for the evil, God's responsible for whatever happens to make up for it, then I think you probably have an untenable position. You probably are not going to be able to salvage the idea of a personal God. But if you think that we're in it with him, that when it comes to the evil occurring, we creatures are in it up to our necks, as a matter of fact, and that we're also in it with him as far as doing something about it, then it's a little bit different, because then I think you can have a personal relationship with God, or speak of a personal relationship with God where the enterprise is the same.
Okay, so that's the problem of evil part. How about these other parts of being a person? The anthropomorphizing, the fact that it's a person that doesn't have a body. We're not aware of persons that have no bodies.
Right. I think that anthropomorphizing is a little bit less dangerous if you realize you're doing it than if you don't realize that you're doing it, right? So I suppose there are a lot of folks out there who anthropomorphize God and don't really give it much thought. They really do believe that God is a pretty much fellow just like us.
Bigger, stronger, tougher.
Bigger, stronger,
smarter.
Tougher, but subject to the limitations of time, for example, in that he has no more touch with the past than we do. He just has a better memory. And when it comes to the future, well, he's going to have to await his opportunities to take action just as we do. And that future is going to approach, and it's going to be here for a second, only to vanish like smoke, and nothing can bring it back, and that's the same for God as it is for us. All right. When you think that, then I think you've carried anthropomorphizing too far.
Okay, but you're still using anthropomorphizing to create this concept of person. So with all the things you've just said, outside of time and just this having present and past in the same instant, that doesn't sound like a person.
Well, no, it doesn't sound an awful lot like a person. But remember that a person is when we speak of personhood in classical theology, at least, we're speaking by analogy. We don't think it's supposed to be literally true. Now, fellows I was just criticizing, the people I was just criticizing, are people who do take it as literally true. That God is just like us, a temporal being with an intellect and a will, yes, but subject to the same limitations that we are when it comes to exercising them.
So your nexus going from to accept the personal being has the critical factor of God not being in time, which changes the character of person, which allows that being to become God.
It changes things in a number of ways. For example, you don't have to worry so much, if God is not in time, about there being some entity that is the bearer of the states of willing and knowing that God has, right? When Hume talked about the self, he spoke as though he couldn't find it. All there were the thoughts that he ran into. Well, if you don't have to persist through time, you don't need a self to carry those thoughts, so you can just look at the thought.